Are we admitting or not?
Yes, we can admit now. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I will wait half a minute for people to join. Actually, I can see everyone has joined now, and people will drift in as we go. So let me start the official introductions. Welcome to this session of the virtual seminars in economic theory. Today, our guest is Stefan Morris from MIT, presenting a joint work with Dirk Bergemann and Tibor Heumann titled Screening with Persuasion. Our guest panelists today are Muir and Andreas Kleiner. And Tibor is also the co-author. Tibor is also with us today. So welcome, everyone. The format, just very briefly, 1 hour presentation followed by 15-minute Q&A session. The audience, the chat is open, so please ask questions and leave comments in the chat. We will monitor that. And if there are any clarifying questions, also you can unmute yourselves and ask directly. But then there's a Q&A session at the end, so you'll have a chance to ask a question. After we finish the Q&A session, the recording will stop, but we are going to stay for a few minutes for an informal talk, chat. So please feel free to stay and use that time to talk informally with everyone present. As a reminder, next week, on the 4th of May, we have Alice Shaw from Dundas presenting Bayesian doublespeak. This is a joint work with Ying-Ho Chang, and guest panelists are Navik, Kartik, and Daniel Kigley. Thank you. And Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So this is joint work with Dirk Bergemann and Tibor Heumann, Screening with Persuasion. So we're going to look at a problem where there is a good of heterogeneous quality that is to be sold to a continuum of buyers. We're going to assume that the seller can choose two things. The seller can choose the information that buyers receive about their values for the good, their willingness to pay for the quality of the good. This is an unusual assumption. Usually we think of buyers knowing their values. We're making a different assumption. But the other thing that the seller chooses is completely standard. The seller chooses the selling mechanism by which buyers buy the good. So you can think of this as combining the classic screening problem. So this is Musa-Rosen combined with a Bayesian persuasion or information design problem. And so there are two main results in the paper. I will focus on the first one, which is to show that the seller will choose a finite partition of buyer values as the information structure, and will therefore, in choosing the mechanism, be offering a finite menu of options. Okay, so the interesting part of this is that this is going to be happening even though the underlying distribution of values is going to be a continuum. So there will be information that is suppressed in equilibrium. And in fact, the second main result says that under relatively weak conditions, the seller will in fact only sell a single item and will provide minimal information to the buyer so that the buyer either buys or doesn't buy, but doesn't know anything beyond that. Okay, let's just get the basic intuition straight. You'll remember that in standard screening problems, so where the type of the buyer is exogenous, in standard screening problems, you'll remember that the seller distorts the allocation from the efficient allocation in order to reduce information rents this leads to a loss of efficiency, but it's worth it to the seller to decrease information rents. What's going on here? Well, it's exactly the same logic as what's going to end up operating. It's just going to operate on a different thing, not on the allocation, but on the information that's used in the allocation. Okay, so the seller is going to choose to suppress socially valuable information, not make it available to the buyer in order to reduce the information rents that the buyers have. And again, this is going to be at the cost of efficiency.
So Stephen,
yep.
Is the assumption that the seller cannot contract with the buyer before the information is released?
Yes, that's a crucial assumption.
Okay.
Can I ask a clarifying question too? So
Yep.
Does the seller know what the buyer's valuation is when the seller provides this information, or is it privately given to the buyer?
Also importantly, the seller does not know the information. I mean, what's really important, so yes, think of our assumption being that the seller does not know the information. I mean, the substantive thing that matters is that the seller is not going to be able to do personalized pricing to offer different menus to different types of buyer. So yes. So this is going to be a pretty stylized theoretical model that combines screening and Bayesian persuasion in a canonical kind of way. However, we are motivated by the digital economy, where we know that information is being controlled in all kinds of complicated ways. So we're familiar with the fact that sellers or platforms can partially control the information of buyers. Here we're making the extreme assumption that the seller could completely control what information buyers are able to receive. While our leading assumption is that the seller simply doesn't observe the buyer's valuations, he can just control what signals they observe. An alternative interpretation might be that the seller knows the buyer's values, but is unable to use personalized pricing, in which case it's as if the seller doesn't know it. When we think about trying to map our model into real markets on the internet, what we're thinking about is that this implementation of information, how would people receive information about their valuations? We think of that as being implemented by recommender systems, either explicit recommender systems that advise you what to buy, or implicit recommender systems where you get presented with a set of options, but one option is top of the list, and people tend to pick that, and it's as if they're making a recommendation. Okay, so if there's time, I may come back to talk about this a little bit more, but don't get too distracted by this. This is just how we think about relating the model to the real world, but we're not going to get into institutions in any substantive way. Contribution that we like is that this problem is potentially messy, choosing both the information structure and the mechanism, as you'll see, will depend on what information is given. But what we'll see is that we can reduce the problem to a problem where we're choosing two distributions. We're going to end up choosing a distribution of expected qualities that are getting sold and a distribution of expected values that consumers have. Those will be the choice variables, and revenue will turn out to be a bilinear function of those two distributions. Okay? And there will be constraints there will be constraints on what these distributions could be, and they will be majorization constraints, which is convenient because we can appeal to some nice theorems that appear in Andreas's work. So I'll probably spend a decent percentage of the talk simply setting up this representation of the problem. It will allow us to relate what we're doing to various papers, including a paper of Ellen. But it will also, give us, and now I can't see my slide. Good. It will preview the importance of interaction. It will preview the importance of the interaction of screening and persuasion. Okay. So here's the model. We'll assume that there's a set of available qualities for sale. So the seller, think of the seller having an inventory of qualities that have an exogenous distribution. We'll write capital Q for the CDF on some interval of the real line. Okay. An alternative assumption is that of Musser-Rosen, where instead of an exogenous distribution of qualities that are available to the seller can produce the good, so the seller can endogenize the quality and sell it at a convex production cost. Our main results are go through in either case. We follow Ellen, actually, who focused on the former case for her paper that I'll tell you about. And it's very convenient for us in making our theoretical point. Okay, but we could do it this alternative way, essentially endogenize the qualities that are being sold. Okay, so the seller just has this inventory of qualities that he's trying to make money off by selling to a continuum of consumers. We're assuming that buyers have valuations distributed on an interval of the real line with CDF capital F. And we'll assume that the buyers have quasi-linear utility and that their willingness to pay for quality Q of the good is going to be V times Q. So what we're calling their value is just their constant marginal value of quality. Okay. So that's the model. It's a simple model. So now we want to say, what's the seller to do if he can control what the buyers know about their values and what the selling mechanism is? Okay, so let's do this in steps. So the seller has the ability to choose information. So as always, we can model information by saying the seller chooses a signal or experiment that generates a probability distribution over signals, over some signal space for every possible value of the buyer. But any signal that's chosen will induce a joint distribution conditional on any signal. The buyer will have an expected value of the object. And in fact, it's just the expected value that the buyer really cares about. So we'll write capital G for the induced distribution of values that's induced by this information that the seller gives them. And the nice news is that we have a nice representation of what's the set of distributions that could be induced by the seller. Okay, so going back to Blackwell, we have the observation that there exists a signal that's going to induce distribution of values G if we start from distribution of values F, if and only if G is a mean preserving contraction of F, or F is a mean preserving spread of G. Okay, that's an intuitive statement. It's just saying that it's as if you threw away information, the statistical sense in which you throw away information going from F to G. And the well-known representation of that involves the integral of the CDFs. So this inequality here, so the area under the CDF is always more under G than under F over any interval from V up to the top of the distribution. And because the mean stays the same, we must have equality at the bottom of the distribution. Okay. We are going to, we've said that G and F are CDFs, but we're actually going to find it very convenient to do a lot of our analysis using the inverses of these CDFs. And the inverse is going to have a natural economic interpretation. So the inverse is the map from 0, 1 to possible values with the interpretation of this is that G minus 1 of T is the expected value of the teeth quantile buyer. Okay, so we'll be working with these inverses. This relationship is sometimes called the majorization relationship. So we say that G majorizes F if the same inequalities hold. In fact, it's slightly more general language than talking about mean preserving spreads and contractions, because those are defined about random variables. The majorization relation is a property just of arbitrary functions. Okay, a useful fact is that G majorizes F if and only if F minus 1 majorizes G minus 1, and that's going to be something else that we use. All right, so that's information. Now, the seller, as well as choosing the information, gets to choose the lottery, okay? And we're going to allow the seller, it's going to be crucial for us that the seller can manipulate the effective distribution of qualities being sold. You know, even though there's some primitive exogenous distribution of qualities, the seller could always sell a lottery over possible qualities that would have the effect of changing the distribution of lotteries being sold. Okay, so what the seller is getting to choose is what lotteries over qualities of good to sell and what price to charge for those lotteries. We can appeal to the standard revelation principle in this context for the optimal selling mechanism, given the distribution G of expected values. So we can just consider a direct mechanism for this problem. So the direct mechanism for the problem is going to specify the expected quality of the good that's going to be somewhere between 0 and Q upper bar, corresponding to each expected value in the support of this distribution G. And there's going to be a corresponding price. Okay, notice that the expected quality can be below Q lower bar because I could always choose to not sell anything to a buyer. So put probability less than 1 on different qualities of the object, and that will get the expected quality down. We could get it down all the way to 0 if they're always excluded. Okay. The seller's objective now is going to be to choose the selling mechanism, QP, to maximize his expected profits, but there are some constraints on what direct mechanism he could be using. We're going to want to impose an individual rationality constraint. And in response to a question earlier, it's going to be an interim individual rationality constraint. It's binding after they receive their signal, incentive compatibility constraints, and feasibility constraints. The distribution of expected lotteries that I end up selling has to be consistent with the original endowment of inventory of qualities. Okay, so this is the seller's problem. I'm not writing down these constraints formally because what I want to do is find a nice way of representing this problem, appealing to some other structure. Okay, but this in words is the seller's problem. Okay, well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use the Myasonian insight that revenue is going to depend on the allocation alone. We can express it as a function of the allocation alone. Okay, how's that going to work? Well, as always, local incentive compatibility is going to imply that quality is increasing in the expected value of the good. So the individual rationality and the envelope theorem is going to pin down revenue in the usual way. We have to be a little bit careful here because, we usually appeal to the payoff equivalence theorem that says that quality pins down revenue. But that argument is usually written down for the continuum type case. But I already previewed the results and said that the distribution of expected values is actually going to be discrete. There's going to be a partition, so there'll be a discrete number of expected values. So individual rationality, in fact, won't entirely pin down the payment rule. However, the seller is trying to maximize revenue. So if you work out what payments have to be consistent with incentive compatibility for an increasing Q and minimize revenue, we can get a standard formula that says that expected revenue is just the expected surplus, the first term here, minus an information rent term. I see a hand up.
Yes, Steve, hi.
Hi.
Quick question. So how do you think, you have here multiple buyers and you could, in principle, engineer different signals to different buyers, but I see that basically the mechanism that you propose, it's only a function of the signal that you send to the specific buyer and not the potential signal that you're sending to the rest. I'm a bit confused. If you could comment on that, please.
Yeah, well, what I haven't mentioned is the feasibility restriction. So I'm saying each of the buyers has the option of, he chooses to buy the intended contract for him, but he has the option of buying any of the other possibilities. And we're imposing the constraint that under truth-telling, what they're buying has to be feasible. There's a continuum of buyers, so, we're assuming that if one buyer alone deviated, that would be possible. But I'm just ignoring feasibility so far. This is just saying what is revenue for a given yeah, what revenue is induced by a given Q without specifying whether Q is feasible or not.
I guess, maybe, I'm sorry if this is a confused question. I'm thinking about sort of full extraction. You have multiple buyers, you can design signals to send, to the multiple buyers. You could, in principle, design them, to get correlation among them, and then design a mechanism that sort of achieves full extraction. What is the assumption in the model that prevents you from going there?
I see. We're making the implicit assumption, I suppose, that the buyers, well, ex ante, the buyers are identical. And when you get told your value, you know the distribution from which values are drawn. So I don't see where a correlation comes up. Do you have a thought, Tibor?
I think so we're assuming that first that the signal is about your own value, so you don't observe, and we're precluding sort of common errors, which would introduce a source of interdependence. So if you introduce common errors, then I observe my signal, and
that's helpful. Thanks.
Okay, so what about feasibility? Well, here we're going to do a change of variables, and a change of variables that you want to look at carefully because it's key to how we end up representing the problem. So we can think about a quantile allocation rule where we're going to say, we've already talked about an allocation rule that says for each expected value, what expected quality are you going to get? But now we can ask the question for each quantile, meaning at which quantile are you in the distribution of expected values, what expected quality you're going to get. Okay, so let's define a function, r-1, that maps the 0-1 interval onto quality levels. So the interval 0, Q upper bar. Okay, and let's let this function, r-1 of t, be equal to little q of g-1 of t. So what's this about? Well, we said that g-1 of t is just the expected value of the buyer at the teeth quantile, and little q of that is the expected quality that he's receiving. So in fact, this quantile allocation rule is simply a change of variables for Q. It's a change of variables. We're implicitly, in doing this change of variables, we're implicitly appealing to the fact that Q is going to be monotonic. So there's going to be associative matching of values and expected qualities, expected values and expected qualities. Okay, so we can think about a quantile allocation rule. This had a -1 here. That suggests that I was interested in that this is the inverse of something. What's it going to be the inverse of? Well, if we take the inverse of this expression, we're going to get a CDF on the interval 0 Q bar, and it's going to represent the distribution of expected qualities that are being sold. Okay. Now our question is, so, we've done this change of variables so feasibility is partly, so feasibility is going to be a constraint on the distributions that could arise here. So what restrictions are there going to be on the distribution of expected qualities sold? Well, the seller can pool qualities. That's a mean preserving contraction of the distribution. Notice we're using the same language representation as what we were doing with information. Okay, but the seller can also choose not to sell some qualities, or equivalently to exclude some buyers. That means that the allocation rule Q is going to be feasible if and only if the distribution of expected qualities R satisfies the same constraint that we had before, the majorization constraint that we had before, expressed on these inverses, but without the restriction that these expressions are equal when Q equals Q lower bar. Why? Because we don't have a mean constraint anymore. We're allowing qualities to be thrown away. Okay, so Andreas's paper calls this relation weak majorization. So majorization, but where you relax the equality constraint at the bottom. So now we have feasibility turned into a majorization constraint as well. Okay. So putting all this together, we can substitute the change of variables, rewriting Q as R minus 1. We can substitute it back into that Myasonian formula that we had for revenue. We can manipulate things a little bit, and we can get a nice expression here that says, as a function of the distribution of expected values and the distribution of expected qualities, what is revenue going to end up being? Okay, and what's going on here is that, you know, there will be associative matching, so you will get a certain surplus associated with the distribution of expected values and a distribution of expected qualities. There will be information rent, and putting it together, you get an expression that looks like this. So now the maximization becomes that we want to choose G and R, our decision variables. We've now reduced to just the distribution of expected values and the distribution of expected qualities. We have the constraint that G is a mean preserving contraction of F, or F minus 1 majorizes G minus 1. We have that R minus 1 is a weak mean preserving contraction of Q. So we're maximizing this function subject to those two majorization constraints. The economics of the problem also implies that R minus 1 must be measurable with respect to G minus 1. Why? Because your the expected quality that you're getting allocated must be measurable with what your expected value is. Now, as it happens, this constraint arises as part of a description of a problem. The good news is that actually we can solve this problem ignoring the measurability constraint. and it will turn out that the solution will satisfy this condition. So it's actually not a binding constraint, and that's going to help us.
Do you have an intuition why this constraint is not binding, the measurability constraint? Is there some economic intuition?
Because once I am pooling, so the question is, suppose I've pooled a bunch of buyers, I'm not distinguishing their values. Why would I ever want to introduce randomness in the qualities that they were getting allocated? You might as well give them the expected quality.
Yeah, that sounds convincing. If there's a convex production cost function, for example, could the and the feasibility constraint won't be relevant because of the continuum of buyers, so there's no need.
Yeah, so the intuition is simpler in the production cost version of the model, because you would have no you would have a strict incentive to produce a constant quality for that pool of buyers, because the convex production cost would always make that cheaper.
Okay.
I have a question from Yanne. I can't hear you though. I still can't hear you. You're muted
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. I think sorry. In your paper, there is an extra term R inverse 0 times J inverse 0, right? So I wonder, firstly, how do you define J inverse 0? Is that the lowest value in the support of function J inverse? This is first question. The second question is why you drop that up in your slide, because it's a constant.
Sorry, I missed your question. One question was, how do you define?
How do you define J inverse 0? Because this appears in your paper. In your optimization problem, there is an X term, which is R inverse 0 times J inverse 0. I wonder, how do you define J inverse 0? It's the lowest value in the support function J inverse. Is that correct?
Oh, yes. Sorry. So I'm writing things down as if they were smooth distributions. So you have to come up with an appropriate definition, a generalized inverse, taking into account that the CDF may have mass points.
I say the second question is why you dropped out in your slide. Why? I mean, because it's not optimal. I mean, in your slide, there's no R inverse 0 times J inverse 0. But there, that term appears in your paper, right? So why it doesn't appear in your slide?
Which term?
R inverse 0 times J inverse 0.
Oh, I dropped a constant of integration.
It's a constant? And it depends on J, right? It depends on function J. So why it is constant? I don't understand.
Tibor, can you help me? I know what you mean. There was a constant of integration.
The question is, how do you interpret that dr to the -1 of t? So you can add an r of 0. You should have to, the expression should have an r of 0 plus t of 0, but it doesn't, which appears on the paper, but it doesn't change the analysis. Sort of, it's just how much you charge for the initial quality, but it wouldn't matter. The analysis, I mean, the analysis will stay the same. It's missing like that. In the paper, we had the constant, and here it's not, but it depends on how do you interpret that first quality increment at the initial t equals 0.
I see.
But the result will, I mean, the analysis will go through.
All right, so we like that the problem looks like this. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes relating this to some things. So one thing we can ask is, suppose we take our problem where you're choosing these two distributions, each of which satisfy some majorization constraint, and we can ask what happens if you fix one of them, so you're just doing a maximization problem with one majorization constraint. So those problems then fit in a class described by Andreas in his paper with Moldovano and Strack, where they prove results about maximizing functions subject to majorization constraints and provide zillions of economic applications. I'm going to give economic applications that correspond basically to our problem interpreted the same way, but just making one variable at a time endogenous and holding the other one fixed. So a first question you could ask is, well, what if I didn't allow you to change the information anymore, but looked at the same problem? So that would say that the distribution of values of buyers was just the original exogenous distribution of values of buyers. Well, it turns out Ellen has a rather brilliant paper in the JPE last year on monopoly pricing, optimal randomization, and resale. So they do lots of things, and there are lots of differences in formulation. They write it down with discrete types, I believe, and not continuum types. But at the end of the day, this core piece is going to correspond to just the special, because they look at how do you sell a fixed distribution of qualities optimally. The solution, they write it down as a generalization of Meyerson, and there's an ironing solution, and the solution has the standard ironing logic that under an irregular distribution, the distribution doesn't satisfy the Meyersonian regularity property, you're going to get alternating pooled intervals and full separation intervals. So sometimes you're going to be separating all types over some range, but sometimes you would be pooling. Okay. Another comparison we can make is, suppose it's the case. So let's keep holding the information fixed, but let's give an alternative interpretation where instead we say there's a finite number of players. There are buyers with the same distribution of values of a fixed good, a single good that has fixed quality. And now suppose we interpret Q, instead of being the quality of the good they're assigned, as simply being the probability that they're allocated the object. Okay, now there will be an associated allocation of quality or probability as a function of your quantile. In particular, I could define Q minus 1 to be the probability that you get allocated the good subject to being the teeth quantile buyer and having the highest value. And that will have some induced distribution over probabilities. Now, an observation going back to border maybe is that a symmetric quantile allocation rule, this should say R minus 1, is going to be feasible exactly if it's a mean preserving contraction of the efficient allocation. That being the case, with this reinterpretation, the problem that we're describing, but fixing information, letting the distribution of qualities or quantiles, letting the original distribution be the efficient rule, then the problem reduces to the optimal auction problem, where you have symmetric bidders being allocated this good of a single quality. Okay, so this mapping appears in Andreas's paper to illustrate the connection between Meyerson and their results on maximization subject to majorization constraints. Okay. Let me give one more example. Something else we could do is we could fix the mechanism, but still let the information be endogenous. Okay, so suppose we fix the mechanism. So we fix the distribution of expected qualities being sold, but we were allowed to vary the information. Well, suppose we consider again the many player interpretation, the one we just described, where quality was like probability for each bidder in a many bidder auction setting. Okay. And suppose we restricted the mechanism to be one where we allocate the object to the bidder with the highest value. So the quantile allocation rule, you receive the object with the probability that you have the highest quantile. Well, in a paper published last year, we solved what turns out to be which turns out to be this problem. We said, suppose you have a second price auction, suppose you, the seller, can choose what information each buyer has about his own value. They have some identical information structure about their own value. What information structure would you choose given that they will be playing a second price auction? Well, of course, playing a second price auction, we're constraining yourself, we're constraining the mechanism to be one where the good is allocated to the person with the highest expected value at the second highest price. So we answered this question. What is the answer? Well, it's sort of like an ironing solution again. There, I won't describe the whole thing, but we do have one pooling region and one region where people are fully separated. Okay, so all these problems have the same structure. They could be seen as an extension of ironing. They can be seen as an application of Kleiner et al.'s theorem about maximizing linear functions subject to a majorization constraint. Okay, our problem, there are two majorization constraints. I want to point out that there are distinctive features that emerge from the fact that we have an interaction here. A key feature is that we never get full separation. There is always pooling. So that's different from all these ironing-like examples where sometimes you'll get full separation. There's going to be a brand new argument that says that you always get pooling. And incidentally, you always get pooling independent of the underlying distribution of types. In the ironing extension results, the distribution of types will often appear. So we need a novel argument. Incidentally, if we do this many player interpretation, we do get what is perhaps the closest paper to this one, which is by Dirk and Martin Pessendorfer. We go through differences and similarities in the paper, but this via these connections turns out to be the closest paper. Okay. Results. I have 10 minutes, right? So, okay, so first of all, we could maybe improve on this picture. But let's just give a picture just to give you an idea of what are these objects we're talking about. Suppose the distribution of values is f of v equals v squared. That's a typo. And the distribution of qualities, the exogenous distribution for qualities, is q of q, q of little q is q to the power of a quarter. Okay, so the left panel in this picture plots f minus 1 and q minus 1. In other words, it's mapping from quantiles on the x-axis to f minus 1, which is the higher, darker line. What is the expected, what is the actual value as a function of the quantile? And q minus 1 is plotting what is the quality at that quantile of the distribution, the exogenous distribution of qualities. Okay. On the right-hand side, we're going to tell you what is the optimal solution to the problem that we're talking about. Okay, so what you're seeing here are g minus 1 and r minus 1. They are piecewise linear, piecewise horizontal, I guess. So these represent situations. What we're seeing here is that for the, let's talk about the expected values first. We divide the quantiles into 3 regions. The low region, low quantiles all have a low expected value W1, then there's a region with expected value W2, and a region with expected value W3. In terms of the expected qualities, we see that the low region are excluded because they get 0 quality, but the intermediate ones get a positive but small quality, and the high value guys get a higher quality. Okay, that's just so you can visualize solutions. Our main result is that the optimal G and R are always going to be finite monotone partitional with common support. Don't know what are good words to use here, but here's how we're using words. We're saying that a distribution is monotone partitional if values are partitioned into convex information sets. So there's just a sequence of intervals making up the partition. Monotone partitional is consistent with there being both singletons in the partition and open sets or intervals. Monotone partitional, if it's finite monotone partitional, then we can't have singletons in this partition. We must simply have a finite set of intervals, so there's always pooling. And the common support condition was illustrated in the previous picture. It says that the constants of G minus 1 and R minus 1 are going to be the same. Okay, so that's the theorem. The theorem can be proved in 3 steps. First, you can show that they're monotone partitional. Then you can show that they're finite monotone partitional. This is going to be the key novelty, and I'll sketch that to you. Sorry, the second step shows that there's no full separation, which means they could be countable monotone partitional, but then you show that they're finite partitional. Okay, so I'm going to very briefly mention this argument, but briefly because it's like all the previous arguments and it's a straightforward application of Andreas's theorem, and spend my 3 minutes or something on this. Okay, so first of all, we want to prove that the optimal G and R are monotone partitional. Well, suppose we fix the distribution of expected qualities being sold, then we're simply maximizing a linear function of G minus 1 subject to a majorization constraint. Okay, so Andreas's paper proved that the set of extreme points of the set of distributions that satisfy the relevant majorization constraint that we're looking at, that set of extreme points is monotone partitional. Now, a standard argument is going to imply that the maximum over a convex set is going to be attained at an extreme point of that set, which is monotone partitional. Okay, and that's it. Okay, as we've been saying, this generalizes the logic of ironing. You maybe get some intuition as to why you get monotone partitional extreme points from ironing. Okay, we could also have fixed G minus 1 and shown that R was going to be monotone partitional. Okay, but there could be full separation here. So that step is crucially important for us because it means that we're working with some nicely behaved objects for G and R, and we can do some more work on them. Okay, so the key novelty in this paper is going to be showing that the optimal G and R are countable monotone partitional. That is, there is no full separation occurring at the optimum. Here's the idea of the proof. You know, a key thing in the proof is a key thing to recall is that we're changing two different things. We're deciding whether to pool information types, and we're also deciding whether to pool qualities. So we can distinguish between pooling allocations and pooling information. And the idea of the proof is to show that pooling an allocation over a small interval where there was full separation is going to lead to a third or at most a third order decrease in revenue. Okay, pooling the allocation is giving rise to inefficiency. It's costly. It's going to be but it's going to be at most a third order decrease in revenue. Pooling information over that same small interval, we're going to show, leads to a second order increase in revenue. How? By decreasing the amount of information rents that are out there. Okay, that's the proof. And just very quickly, that's the idea of the proof. So just very quickly, suppose the optimal signal was fully revealing on some small interval of length delta. The optimal allocation, you can show, would have to be strictly increasing on that interval. We could imagine pooling on that interval, that is assigning the average quality that was being assigned while leaving information the same. Okay, that would always be a feasible option. The decrease in total surplus is going to be of order delta cubed. Why is that the case? Well, we have this very small interval. There's going to be a change of value on that interval of order delta. There's going to be a change in quality that is of order delta. And there's going to be a probability that we're in that interval, an F with some smooth prior. So if it's a small interval, that's going to be of order delta. Okay. On the other hand,
Stephen, just very briefly, the Q star, will it be, so this is the argument uses that it will be continuous, right? Why is that the case? You can also postpone if we are running out of time.
Yes, I think that it will be continuous, but I'm not thinking of the right argument right now. So, so there we were just changing the allocation. Suppose we also think about pooling the types on that interval. We were assuming initially they were separated. Notice the intuition here is that if we're going to pool the allocation, we might as well pool those types. Why would we want to give them excessive information rent? But anyway, suppose we pool those the information of those types as well. And let's write mu q and mu v for the average quality and value on this interval under the optimal signal and allocation. Okay, under the pooled allocation, there is, if we were just pooling the allocation, there would be a quality increase that occurred at V1, that we would be going from Q star of V1 up to the average quality mu Q. Okay. When the information is unchanged, that quality increase is going to be priced at its value to the marginal type, who is V1. But if we pool the information, the quality increase is going to be priced by the marginal type, who has value mu v, okay, the average value, which is going to be higher. So the seller is going to be getting strictly more revenue. Okay, that increase in revenue, here's the key fact, is going to be reflected in the payments of type V1, types in the interval V1, V2, and types above V2, because that's the way information rent works. Okay, so the increase in payments and thus profit is going to be of order, the increase in payment, that's of order delta, the quality increase, that's of order delta, times the probability that the value is above V1, that is of order greater than delta. That's the probability that the value is greater than V. Okay, so I think I'm out of time. That is the main things that I wanted to say. And I will conclude by saying we solved a pretty canonical combination of mechanism design and information design. We showed that it corresponds to two majorization constraints. The economics of it is we just see another version of the classical rent efficiency trade-off, but now operating in how information gets spread around. You know, if we want a digital market takeaway, the important thing here is that we were saying that information, we were talking about providing information about vertically differentiated goods. And we've just identified the perhaps obvious fact that for vertically differentiated goods, there is a constraint on giving away socially valuable information, which is that sellers giving the socially valuable information away may reduce the rent that sellers are able to get. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. You are not out of time because we started late because I was so long in introductions. So thank you very much. We are going now to the official Q&A sessions, but if you are not able to ask questions right now, remember we will stay even after 1/4 the hour. Okay, as is our tradition, we'll start with our panelists. Ellen and Andreas, any last comments or questions before we move to the audience?
Yes. So my question, which I wanted to ask about, is whether or not you've done a consumer surplus analysis in the paper, and whether or not there's anything interesting that happens in terms of consumer surplus as a result of the interaction between the sort of mechanism design problem and the information design problem. I was also wondering if it's possible to say rank consumer surplus relative to maybe what a social planner would do, what would happen under the fixed information problem, what would happen under the fixed mechanism problem, and then what would happen if the designer has the freedom to choose both of these things, and maybe whether you could provide conditions under which maybe the information design problem is harming consumers relatively more than, say, the mechanism design aspect of the problem.
Yep. So maintaining the assumption that a seller can potentially choose the information and choose the mechanism, we could ask what happens to consumer surplus, and then what would happen if they could only do one or the other. Yeah, I think I don't know that we've thought about that particular question. Maybe Tibor has a good answer. We've thought about a different question, which is, suppose we've been talking about picking the information structure, the seller choosing both the information structure and the selling mechanism. A different question you could ask is, suppose some designer picked the information structure in order to maximize consumer surplus, anticipating that the seller would choose the mechanism conditional on the particular information structure that is chosen. So that's an interesting problem. It behaves completely differently in the sense that you don't have this force towards guaranteeing pooling everywhere. You get a more continuous mechanism. It reduces, it generalizes Rocher and Shentes. Rocher and Shentes ask what would be the best information structure for the consumer. But they ask that question, but where the seller has, where we know ex ante that the seller's mechanism is just going to be a posted price, so that makes the problem relatively well behaved. The seller's mechanism can be more complicated in general. But Tibor, could you say anything about consumer surplus in?
Yeah, it usually, when the seller can control both, usually consumer surplus goes down a lot. So we focus a lot on the single item mechanism. So when you want to just sell a single item, and then consumer surplus is 0. So it's very stark. I think we have an example where consumer surplus could go up if you control information allocation relative to controlling only allocation, but it takes a lot of effort to come up with it. Because you need at least 3 items, and it's usually, I would say that consumers get harmed without where they usually informal.
Yeah, but I guess often in these kinds of price discrimination problems, you do get these kind of countervailing effects where sometimes consumers may be better off if you hand a seller sort of more effective tools for price discrimination, and sometimes consumers end up worse off. So I was just wondering if in this case it always goes in one direction, because it does seem like, you know, this is making it very easy for the seller to extract a lot of rents from the consumers.
We have conditions under which it goes down, general conditions such, but not always. And I'm almost sure we had an example where it would go up. So we can have conditions on distribution so that the consumer surplus is guaranteed to go down, but I don't think it's true for every distribution.
Okay, Ellen, if that's all questions for now, then Andreas, maybe any last comments or questions?
Maybe just very briefly. So now that we know the answer to the problem we looked at, I'm also curious, do you have any ideas how things would look like if the buyers already have some private information to start with, or do you think that's completely intractable?
Well, it's certainly the natural case, a more natural case to consider. I mean, I think you would have to find some modeling trick by which you could analyze the buyer's initial information separately from the information that the seller was providing. If they were sort of garbled together, it would be very hard to analyze.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Right. Francesco, you had a question I noticed before, just before the top of the hour.
Yeah, I didn't want to. Can we go back to the slides with the picture? Just it was probably a silly question, but just to check the intuition. So here we have, as you told us, that you're not selling to these people, but you're giving them some information. You're telling them what their expected value is. Is this because on the F, well, you have this constraint that the G has to be exactly a mean preserving contraction of the F. So you got to give them some information, even if you're not serving them. Or is there another reason that is a bit more profound than that? So
Sorry, say that again?
So in other words, you have that W1, the pooling set is exactly there, right? But you're not, but R1, so basically you're not serving them, you're cutting them off. So in a way, why would you give them information if you're cutting them off? Who cares, right?
Oh yes, it doesn't matter. You could give them.
So my intuition was this is because you still need that the G is a mean preserving contraction of the F. You got to tell something just to keep that constraint. Is that what it is? So what is it? Something different that basically you have to have everything averages out to the prior. Basically, is that the reason?
No, I think that in this case we're making a ad hoc assumption that you don't reveal any information if you're in this downward interval, but if you're not selling the object, there will be alternative information that you could give them as long as they still exclude themselves.
Right. So this, you're saying this is not pinned down, basically. You just picked a W1. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
I'm saying I was yeah, I think so. One could choose a different information consistent with the mean preserving contraction constraint, as long as this type. No, but there will be a binding incentive constraint.
Yeah, that's what. So I was wondering whether there was something a little bit deeper here.
There will be a binding incentive constraint that that I want these types between 0 and x1 not to get the allocation that type W2 are supposed to get.
Okay, yeah.
And that constraint should be binding. And if I didn't pool all these guys at W1, that would mean that there would be somebody with a higher valuation. And you might think that would violate the...
Right.
Yeah.
But this would still mean that you could go below W1 in principle if you're free to do that, right? You could tell them less than that. So these guys are being told, there's a bunch of people who are being told you're W1, right? That's your expected value.
Right, but if we lower W1,
Mm-hmm.
we are
so we're saying that W1, W2, W3 are unique, basically, or certainly in a given.
But I'm not saying that they're unique, but I'm saying that the values will be pinned down by...
Pinned down, yeah. Given, yes, there may be... but given W2 and W3, you need to pin down W1. That's what you're saying. I need to read the paper to see
Always.
the calculation.
Francesco, always read the paper.
Well,
Can I take this opportunity to sort of officially close the meeting? So before we stop recording, thank you, Stefan, for the great presentation. We had a very good audience today. Thanks the panelists, and Tibor is still here. Yes, thank you, Tibor, for joining us together, and see you next week. And now we can